While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud a voice came that said, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." Please be seated. 3 years ago, Nicole and I found ourselves standing on a hillside above Cody, Wyoming. The plains spread before us in every direction, brown and gold for miles and miles, receding into the far distant horizon. We were in the middle of discerning what came next in our lives. We were both ready to move on from our jobs, and Nicole had applied for a position running a new program for young adults in the greater Yellowstone area. We'd flown to Cody to see if it was a good fit, and whether that was the place that God was calling us. We loved the idea of going somewhere new, something totally different, living out that old American dream of packing up and going west. Maybe that was the 7 months of being cooped up in our 2-bedroom apartment in Portsmouth talking. This was October of 2020, after all. But whatever it was, we were open to this grand idea. Then we encountered the reality of it. In that place, looking out over those plains, we were struck by a feeling on one hand of awe and wonder at this landscape so different than what we knew, but also by a feeling of unease and disorientation over just how vast it all was. There's a boundlessness to that landscape. It spread across our fields of vision with nothing to break it up. We're both East Coast people. I've lived most of my adult life, most of my life in the eastern United States, where the horizon is always limited. Whether that's by trees and forests or by mountains, you just don't get to see that far. And I didn't realize just how small my field of vision had been for my whole life. And how much the places most familiar to me are ones with boundaries. And it never occurred to me just how comforting that was until I was standing there contemplating living somewhere that was so wholly different. There in Cody, I realized the extent to which I am both awed by and afraid of vastness. That feeling has come to me at other times as well. A couple years earlier, Nicole and I went to the Grand Canyon for the first time. And as I looked over the edge, I experienced my entire childhood fear of heights coming rushing back to me all in an instant. I stood at the edge of that canyon. Well, I didn't stand at the edge of the canyon. I stood a safe distance, about 12 feet back from the edge of the canyon, paralyzed and terrified by the dizzying height and the vast gulf opening before me. It's probably the one time in our relationship when Nicole and I have been on a hike, and she has been the bolder and more adventurous and ambitious one. And I'm the one who's plastered against the wall of the canyon, just having to fight every instinct in me in order to go a few more steps. I think I'm not alone in feeling uneasy about vast spaces. We have a whole lexicon to describe the feelings that boundless places inspire, both those feelings of fear and of awe. There's kenophobia, which is the fear of empty space. Astrophobia, the fear of outer space. There's thalassophobia, the fear of oceans. Acrophobia, the fear of heights. Nyctophobia, the fear of the dark. And heliophobia, the fear of the sun, of bright lights. And he even learned that some people claim to have something called casadastrophobia, which is the fear of falling into the sky. Along with these fears of vast and open spaces, we use words like sublime, grand, majestic, sweeping to try and describe the smallness that we can feel in the middle of a cosmos and a world that can seem and is so much bigger than us. In our gospel reading today, we read about three of Jesus' disciples, Peter, James, and John, who have to contend with their own sudden awareness of just how small they are. Jesus takes them with him to the top of Mount Hermon so that he can pray. And as Jesus kneels there, those three disciples begin to fall asleep. And then suddenly everything changes. In front of their eyes, Jesus is lifted up, his face changed, his clothes radiating a dazzling white. Alongside him appear Moses and Elijah, and the disciples can hardly believe their eyes. In that instant, they go from fighting off sleep to suddenly being confronted with the fullness of the glory of God. In that moment, God's light shines through Jesus. God's glory radiates through him. And in that moment, it's clear to them that he is much more than just their friend, teacher, and guide. Then the vision fades as quickly as it appeared, and the disciples find themselves overshadowed by a cloud. And in that instant, go from glimpsing God's light radiating through Jesus into this brightness of this cloud, from which they hear God speak, "This is my Son, my chosen. Listen to him." And that voice knocks them back in fear. Not only did they see their teacher and friend transfigured and suffused with God's light, but they now have the voice of God booming out and confirming it for them. That Jesus is more than who they could have imagined him to be. He is God's Son, the chosen, the Messiah, whose very nature is the nature of God. On that mountain, with Jesus' transfiguration, the disciples look into the boundlessness of God. They encounter a God who is so much bigger and greater than them, whose life they can only attempt to imagine and to capture with their eyes. They see it first through the light radiating from Jesus, and then encounter it forcefully booming out of that cloud. They're overwhelmed by just how big it is. And suddenly their small world in a quiet corner of Judea and the Roman Empire is blasted open. And before them, gaping like the Grand Canyon, is the glory of God shining out of Jesus' blindingly white clothes. They're mesmerized by it. They're terrified by it. They're left speechless, much like the Israelites and Moses wandering through the desert centuries before. Over those few days in Cody, the uneasiness that I felt about the vastness of that landscape never dulled. Every time we stepped out of our room, the enormity of the plain stretched out before us. But despite the immensity of that space, I found that my focus slowly started to begin to shift. And I began to notice the particulars of the landscape. I drew my gaze down from the horizon and towards what was immediately in front of me. Began to notice the resilience of life in that environment. Scraggly sage plants perfectly adapted to the arid land, giving off a sharp and savory odor whenever I brushed against them. I could see the stripe of dark green created by the canopies of cottonwoods huddled around what little sources of water emerged from the dry land. I saw birds flitting through the undergrowth, making their home and shelter in whatever cover was available. Shadows dappled the surface of the land, cast by each small and rise and undulation of the landscape. Each small detail stood out against the backdrop of the vast expanse. The same land that first felt so overwhelming also presented itself in intricate detail and a kind of sparse beauty. It could be both subtle and understated, and at the same time grand and sweeping. Those small details only stood out more when framed by the enormity of it all. The disciples there on that mountain don't stay in the place of fear. In Matthew's telling of the Transfiguration, after the voice of God trails off and the cloud dissipates, Jesus comes over to them, touches them, and says, "Do not be afraid." The same Jesus who they had just seen lifted up and bathed in God's light is now touching them gently on the shoulder, inviting them to come down the mountain with him. In this transfiguration, we see one of the central paradoxes of the Christian faith playing out. It is a moment when the full nature of God is present, when we see who Jesus is, both fully human and fully divine. And it's the first moment where the disciples start to get it. That the same Jesus who walked with them, who taught them, who broke bread with them, who healed the sick, raised the dead, who shared stories with them, who slept alongside them, who went out into the boats with them, who cast nets alongside them. That same Jesus who they knew so closely was also God's Son. Just as he walked with them, so God's light shone within and through him, bridging the gap between heaven and earth. He is both one of them and something different. The fear that they felt there on the mountaintop didn't take away from the closeness of their relationship with him, but only added to it. Like sagebrush and cottonwoods framed by the vastness of the plains, the boundlessness of God's being makes the fact that Jesus invites his disciples to know him intimately and personally all the more miraculous. Christian faith. Our faith is built on what is revealed in the Transfiguration. God is unimaginably above us, beyond us, and different from us. Something fundamentally different than who we are. And we, in our human limitations, struggle to imagine what God is like. We only get the chance to see and hear God in glimpses, fragments, echoes, and reflections. And yet, that same God is very near to us, walking with us, leading us into every decision and choice that we make, hearing every prayer that we offer, knowing our hopes and our dreams, our fears and anxieties, our joys, and the things that make us laugh. That same God is constantly reaching out to us in love, just as God sits enthroned above the whole cosmos. The fear and awe that the disciples or the Israelites in the desert felt towards God is not separate from the love and closeness that they experienced with Jesus. They are both necessary parts of faith, intertwined, complementing one another, building each other up as part of one richly textured relationship with our God. If you're wondering how the story ended, Nicole and I both knew that Cody, Wyoming was not the right place for us. But we had to go there, and we had to experience it in order to know that and to learn something about ourselves. By confronting the otherness of that landscape, we were able to hear the voice of God calling us in a different direction. We didn't know what that path was at that time, but we knew we hadn't found it yet. And so we returned to New Hampshire with a more clarity and a renewed sense of purpose. God would show us the way. And 3 years later, here we are. Another way emerged. May we all come to experience, like those disciples on the mountain, the glory of God, as well as God's closeness to us. May we encounter a God who is wholly other, different, above us, beyond us, unimaginable to us. But may we also experience the God who is present at the very core of our being. May we cultivate a capacity for fear and awe, but also receive the tender invitation to get up and to follow. May we recognize our own smallness and also take comfort in knowing that God walks with us every step of our lives.